Hello, hi everyone. We want to greet all our presenters today. They did a really nice presentation. We have from a very specific technical view about how dams can affect the social environmental areas. And also we have the very interesting point of view from how this big infrastructure can affect the local communities in reality, in the ground. So now we're gonna start with Dr. David Wagner. I have two questions for you, and then we're gonna go to the other presenters. So the first question is from Robert Bushbacher. He said, how can we, as outsiders who have no authority, engage with decision makers to convince them to engage in participatory adaptive management program as laid out there? And the second question is from Luz Jimenez. She said, how to get the confidence of power generators and environmental authorities at the same time in decision making?
Okay, two very good questions, and they are unfortunately consistent questions that are associated with adaptive management programs around the world. The first one is, how do you gain credibility, and I would call structure with decision makers to allow stakeholder groups to have presence in the discussion? And where I found there's kind of three general ways that can happen. One is that the government, as in the case of several opportunities in the United States, directed that an adaptive management program would be implemented. So it basically told the agencies, you will do it. Government legislative processes are one way. The second way is sometimes court decisions or litigation has been used where the courts will direct that science and an adaptive management approach be implemented to resolve conflicts between various user groups. So that's the second way. The third way is when the agencies recognize that they are going to be faced with increased litigation, courts, increased I would say people, stakeholders upset about the process, so there'd be demonstrations that are going to look badly on the company or the agency who is implementing an action. Or thirdly, the agencies, what I would say, grow up and realize that the future dictates that we work together rather than in the traditional, I will tell you what I'm going to do approach. So in any of those three applications, it takes time to accomplish. And I will use the example of, and I think Dr. Julian, you used the example, or one of you did, on Glen Canyon Dam. The Grand Canyon Protection Act is what gave the authority to implement the long-term adaptive management process. That was Congress, the United States Congress, dictating in a law that it will be done. So that is one way. In the Columbia River Basin, the courts have often been the major driver on implementing the type of science that is necessary to address the biological opinions or the operational processes that either the Bureau of Reclamation and or the Corps of Engineers are implementing. So it takes time, it takes process, it does not occur overnight, and you have to work at that from various different levels to achieve success. Can you repeat the second question, please?
Yes, sure. The second question is from Luz Jimenez, and she asked how to get the confidence of power generators and environmental authorities at the same time in decision making.
Well, it kind of flows right from the answer I gave the first time. If they are directed to do it, they can establish a process that will invite and then encourage the appropriate stakeholders to be engaged in the process. That process, in my understanding of where other programs have found success, is that process often needs to be facilitated at the very front end to ensure that the agencies listen to the stakeholders in what their concerns are, what their issues are, and what their expectations are in terms of process. Now, that does not mean that every expectation will be met, but we need to get them out there so that there can be a valuable discussion around them in respect to how an adaptive management program can be shaped. Example of a river, the Tempisque River in Costa Rica. I was working on that years ago with the Heinz Center out of Washington, D.C. And those local folks were concerned about several proposed dams that were being funded by the Japanese government to come in for irrigation for agricultural use. We opened up a process down in Costa Rica after meeting with the stakeholders and local farmers, local fishermen, and local villages about what their concerns were, and got them some expertise and basic knowledge on how to interact within the framework of the laws, et cetera, that were available to them. So it's often a big part of it initially is getting the local folks knowledgeable about what tools are available to them, and then creating a process and I would call it a forum, I guess, where stakeholders and the government agencies, the power companies, the typical developers can be, and often they have to be forced to have the dialogue necessary to begin the discussion. So again, it's a process, it takes time, and you have to bring various tools and entities to the table to get it started.
Okay, thank you very much. We really appreciate your answer. Now we are gonna continue with some questions for Dr. Julian Alden. So the first one, we don't have the name yet, but it says impacts of dam are much more comprehensive than its known impact of fish on fisheries. How can we expand the concept of less detrimental dams to other uses, including other biological groups, cultural and health values? That is the first question. The second question, can you explain the positive correlation between native and non-native species abundance and why it gets almost vertical? And the third question is from Robert Fonseca. I've been seeing a trend on accepting the concept of reservoirs connectivity, using fish as the main argument for the constructions of new developments with less detrimental impact. Impacts of dams are much more comprehensive. Oh, this is the first one, right? Carolina Arantes. Julian, great talk. Thanks. This question is also related to your results plot, showing patterns for native and non-native species. Are there any species or species group that may be driven patterns of responses for native and non-native responses? For example, is the native species group dominated by periodic strategies and non-native dominated perhaps for equilibrium species? How do you think responses would look like if you fine-tune analysis for life history or other functional role of species, and what are the implications?
Let's see here. The first question, which is near and dear to my heart, was this idea of, can we use these approaches beyond kind of ecological responses? And this idea of kind of incorporating kind of cultural, or the question was cultural or health values. And I actually think this is some of the most exciting kind of parts of this work. Elizabeth Anderson and others convened a really awesome working group a couple of years ago, and then she published a paper in Wires Water that's kind of looked at this idea of socio-hydrology. So this call to arms for both more collaboration between natural and social researchers or social scientists when we think about kind of the values of rivers. Some of the discussion that we had there, and I'm actually quite excited about getting into, is this idea of how do we go beyond flow ecology relationships when we think about multi-objective optimization, and think about how we synthesize or how we think about prescribing cultural flows. This idea of how do we synthesize knowledge of the relationships between people and the social, cultural, and religious context by which those rivers are important. And in these types of kind of analytical approaches, it needs to be quantified. And that's where the challenge comes, is how do we kind of quantify flows with respect to these kind of social, cultural, and religious benefits. Some of the ways that we thought about doing that is, for example, particular flows are required for the transport of houseboats along the river, and how that changes seasonally. The force of water or discharge obviously is important for providing cleansing areas and particular waters. And then obviously flooding of floodplains often are used or coincide with festivals and ceremonies that occur on rivers in a number of cultures. So if we can kind of link flow to some of those measures which describe cultural and religious, then there's no reason why those can't be also incorporated into these types of multi-objective trade-offs. The second question was talking about that relationship between native and non-native species in that optimization plot. And I guess the simple thing is that I just wanted to highlight there is that any flow that we prescribe in that context below a dam necessarily can benefit native species, but it also will benefit non-native species. It's a crazy notion, but non-native fish even need water as well. And they need water and flow regimes exactly the same way the native species do. That's why they persist there, and that's why they establish there. But it's the nuances of that trade-off, which is super important. And it comes down to then values. Do we value a 20% increase in native species more than, say, a 5% increase in non-native species? Right? So it's that essential trade-off between the two which needs to be navigated. And that Pareto frontier, which I showed, provides the tools to actually assess that trade-off in terms of actually prescribing flows. And that leads into the last question, which was the fact that those trade-offs play out differently depending if you're native or non-native species. And what I didn't have time to show there, but it's in the paper, is it describes the fact that particular native species really benefited from those optimal flows. But there's also actually some non-native species that benefited as well. And unsurprisingly, species that require the same hydrologic conditions, i.e. they share the same life history strategies in relation to flow, also together benefit or get reduced in response to that flow. So I think I tied together the three questions somehow. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, you did it, and thank you very much. A very clear explanation, and I think everybody is happy with your answer.
Now we're going to move to preguntas for Ocelio. We have two questions for him. The first one is from Renata, and she said, hello, Sergio, thank you so much for your presentation. It's always very important to know more about the fights and social movements. I would like to know how this discussion that you mentioned about the definition of the concept of the group you have at national level, thinking about these proposals of legislation by MED with the impacted individuals,
Como os pescadores. Abraços.
and how these impacted communities are reacting, such as the fishers. The second question is for Guilherme. Muito obrigado. Thank you so much for the presentations, very nice presentations. During the construction of the hydroelectrical complex of Madeira, and the individuals, communities were in receive any kind of indemnification for the movement have defended, considering that the people that are affected are not only those who are owners of the land. Aqueles impacted, people that we defended, those who are impacted socially or economically. So we will put our foot down for anyone that will be affected in any kind to their daily living or the quality of life. If they flood the soccer field, or they flood a church, or they have to go through a community, even though they don't have the, we consider not only the owners but also the impacted individuals, and we have to define a directed or undirected affected individual, independent from the fact that they are owners of the area or the productive activity that they develop. They will be the directed impacted, especially the craft fishers we called, and they lose part of their job due to the construction of these dams. So we defended that concept, a concept that will affect their income or even the transportation that they have to use to go through the river. Communities that has an impact around their livelihood. We presented a proposal for the national policy. This is a publication that we did with these concepts of policies around the dams constructions, including this concept, but in a more extended version. And we have this work not only in the area of the compensations that the hydroelectrical dams will pay. Every region impacted by the dam construction should be recognized. In Rondonia, we conducted the river down and the downstream area and the upstream area, because not only the impacts are downstream, but also in the communities that are upstream the river where the dam was constructed. Many companies only consider the impact communities, the ones that are in a particular geographic radio downstream. So they are reducing their consideration of the impacted communities. In the legislation of Brazil, they do not consider them impacted communities. And that's why we presented this proposal. Also, the individuals that live far away from the river, but they depend on the river products to live or for their lively income, such as fishers that came from far away, they are also impacted individuals that have to be considered into the debate. I don't know if I respond to both questions. Please let me know. Thank you so much, Celio, for your responses. I think that it was quite clear, and also to understand the impacts of the local communities. Now, as we have 11 minutes.
So we have one question here, which is for David and Julian. This question was from Lisa Davenport, and she's asking, I am also interested in downriver impacts of dam, but mostly on beach nesting birds or any wildlife really, that are dependent on natural disturbance regimes and particularly beach formation.
Okay, well, I will start off and you can correct me and fill in the blanks. How's that? There are several examples that I can think of right off the top of my head where we've looked at the releases of dam releases and the effects on downstream sediment deposits and therefore riparian vegetation and the species that utilize that habitat. One, of course, would be Glen Canyon dam releases and the impacts in the Grand Canyon. There's a rich history there, and if you give me your email, I'll be happy to give you the links to some of those studies. The second one is work that's been done on the Snake River and the Hells Canyon Dam in particular, and the downstream of the continued diminishment of the sediment deposits and what that's done to the species, the riparian habitat and the species that depend upon it. There's also been work done on several eastern United States rivers that I know of and several in Japan. So there are other river systems that are controlled by upstream dam releases that I'll be happy to provide you specific links to.
Great, and I have nothing to add to that.
Thank you very much. And now we are going to the last three questions for you, Julian. So let me go back here. Give me a second, please.
I did also,
okay.
I also did send chats back to folks.
Brian Millikan, and the question is, how does the model apply to the Amazon consider impacts of altered river flow below dams on flooded forests that are essential for feeding and reproduction of migratory and not migratory fish species? How is historical data on seasonality incorporated into the model? How does the model consider sediment flows that are essential for freshwater ecosystems, floodplains, agricultures, and other ecosystem services? And then we have two questions from David Kaplan. The first one is, great, well, he is saying, great, thanks, Julian. I would love to ask a nerdy question later about whether your models include biological interactions among species, or do all species respond independently to the flow regime? And the second question from him is, how do we frame optimal even when it is substantial effects, like a 20% loss in connectivity for Brazilian 2040 plan is optimal, but is still a large effect?
Great. I will, I sent individual chats to folks to try to address some of these questions, but I will iterate quickly because for the sake of time. Brent, thanks for your question. Yeah, this idea of like, how much complexity can we layer into these models, right, to really truly reflect kind of the ecological interactions and the processes which we know are important in river systems. So you asked this question, you know, can sediment flows be incorporated into this, et cetera? And yeah, I mean, it's like any model can be made more complex. I like to call this the Goldilocks effect. There's the simple fact that you only want a model to be as complex as it needs to be. And sometimes it can be too complex in the sense that then can't be really used. And then in a multi-objective context, once you start to get to 4 or more objectives that you're trying to optimize, it gets very, very challenging. So that's why I think you see that most of the ecological or the physical response variables that are included in optimization include kind of just single dimensions, like that Schmidt paper et al. In the Mekong, which was looking at sediment delivery downstream, or some of the ecological papers that we've been doing where we're looking at just fish abundance. So lots of scope. And David, your last question, obviously I sent you a message, but we'll share it to everyone. Yeah, you're right. 25, let's say a 25% loss in connectivity. How is that optimal for fish, right? And I think the challenge is that, as we all know, you add any dam to a river system, by definition, connectivity has to go down, even if there is a fish passage on that dam. So I think the challenge is that given a future which will include hydropower, what is then the optimal siting or optimal environmental release schedules that can kind of minimize impacts on native species? And I guess I would just close just real quick with this simple premise. I think as a community, kind of having a unified voice about what we envision new dam construction would look like, or current management of dams might look like in the future. And I've been a very strong proponent of going beyond environmental impact assessments and trying to force the issue that environmental flow prescriptions, that is flows for rivers, should be mandated for any new river system that's going to be built. So the fight does not end after a dam has been built. And I think, if you look at the Brisbane Declaration with respect to environmental flows, the point that we try to make there is the fact that if we incorporate that into the process, even dams that are built, I believe can be more ecologically sustainable.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for our three presenters for answer all our questions. And just a reminder for the people who are hearing us, if you have more questions, you can just address directly to them, so they will be more than happy to clarify any question or answer any other question, or either provide some materials that you will need. So thank you very much. We go back with our moderator, David Kaplan.
Thank you, Marlise. As always, excellent with the questions. And I just want to thank all of our speakers again, and just remind everyone of what the largeness of the topic we're trying to talk today, which is governance, adaptive management, and alternatives. And I think we were able to actually hit all of those themes in thinking about adaptive management as a process that requires governance. And we saw an example of where governance was insufficient to really succeed or supply the framework. We saw about alternatives, you know, thinking about Julian's trade-offs, and whether they're called optimal or suboptimal, thinking about a trade-off space where optimal for you doesn't look like optimal for me. And sectors of the economy and sectors of society have different views of that word optimal, and the ability to develop alternatives is the only, as Dave Wagner called it, scientific predictions about the future. But those include things like how communities may respond to things, as Julian, you said, like reduced ability to for health, wash, and sanitation, for floodplain inundation, and for other societally supportive ecological flow requirements. So I thank you very much, all the presenters, and if you all go down to your reactions and give a nice round of applause for all of our speakers.